So as I've touched on in previous lessons, Excel has some added functionality called formulas, and formulas are a way of performing calculations or actions in Excel by using words that Excel can recognize. So an example of that is what's known as a sum formula. So looking at the data that we have in front of us, we have 12 months worth of sales in column B, and what we want to do is we want to sum those. So what I can do is I'm going to add a new row, and at the bottom I'm going to write total. I'm going to make this bold, and in cell B14 I'm going to type equals sum, open brackets, and then I'm going to select the range that we have entered the data into, and then I'm going to close brackets and I'm going to hit enter, and you can see that Excel has automatically summed up those values for us. Now that sum is live, so if I was to change one of those numbers to 500, it automatically updates the value for us. There's a few other basic types of formula that are quite similar to that. So if I wanted to count the number of sales values that I have in that table, we know there's 12 because there's 12 months in the year, but let's say we didn't know how many there were. I could do a new cell here called count, and I could type equals count, open brackets, and select the cells again, close brackets, and hit enter. It comes up with 12. Now it's put $12 because it thinks we're talking about dollars. We're not talking about dollars, so I'm going to go up here to formatting and change that to general. So it's just a number 12, not $12. And finally, you can do something called average, which brings up the mean average of the values. So I type average in here, and then I'll type equals average, open brackets, select the data, close brackets, and hit enter. And you can see that the average value of those 12 months was $34,978. So the key thing that all of these three formulas have in common are that they all start with the equal sign. Now, whenever you use the equal sign at the start of a cell, Excel will know that you're telling it that you're about to type a formula or you're about to type a mathematical calculation. So, for example, I think I could also type equals 10 plus 10. So that's a mathematical calculation as opposed to an Excel function, which is what a sum is. So sum is what's known as a function, and the whole thing that we've written in the cell is what's known as a formula. And the equals 10 plus 10 that I wrote a second ago is also a formula. So as I mentioned, there's over 400 formulas in Excel, and you can see most of them by clicking on the formulas bar just here and drilling down into the various different menus. Now, the vast majority of them won't make sense. That's okay, because when I look at this financials list just here, the vast majority of them don't make sense to me either, because I don't often have the need to use these. But there are some really, really useful ones in here. In the recently used list, you can see there's some others here like max. Max will pull back the highest value in a range. So that's some basic formulas. There's one other thing I want to show you here, which is what's known as relative and absolute references. This is a really, really key point when you're using formulas. If you don't understand what this means, it can cause you to make errors in your formulas quite easily. So I'm just going to delete this over here, and I'm going to add in a new column here, which is going to be called 3-month average. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a running average in this column of the last 3 months worth of sales. So we're going to start it in March, so we've got 3 months worth of history, and I'm going to type equals average of these 3 cells. Okay? And in the next row, what I want to do is I wanted to average these 3 cells. Now, I could go in and I could type that formula. I could type it in every row all the way down the page. I don't really want to do that because it's going to be quite tedious, even in a small table like this. So if I take that formula and I drag it down the page here down to the bottom, it expands the formula. And if I just take another row here and I'm going to double click into October, you can see that it has actually automatically averaged those 3 months, which is fantastic. So what Excel has done here is every row I've dragged it down the page, it's increased the numbers in this formula by 1 each time. So it's gone B2 to B4, B3 to B5, B4 to B6, and so on. Let's say I wanted to do something slightly different here. If I wanted to add in a running total column, and what I want to do is I want to add in a running total of all the sales throughout the year so that when I get down to December, it equals that total 419,000 that we have. So in the first month, it's just going to be whatever we had for the sales in the first month. So for February, I can type equals our running total plus February sales. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag that column down to December, and you can see it's created a running total for us. Now what we've done here in these two examples is we've used something called relative references. What a relative reference is it means that Excel knows it's okay to increase the numbers as you drag it down the page. If you don't want Excel to increase the numbers as you go down the page, or the columns as you go across the page, then you need to use something called an absolute reference. And an absolute reference allows you to basically fix different parts of the formulas so that they don't move. So if I add in one more column here just to show you, and it's going to be percentage of the total. Okay, so it's going to be percentage of total. And we know that the total is 419,000. So what we're going to do is we're going to say equals January's figure divided by 419,000. Okay, so it's come up with a decimal. I'm going to go back to the home ribbon here. I'm just going to make it into a percentage. And I'm going to drag it down the page. Oh, whoops, it didn't work. Now, why didn't that work? Well, if I click into cell E3 here for February, you can see it's done B3 divided by B15, not B14. So B14 is what we wanted to divide it by, but because we've gone down a row, it's moved that row down one. We didn't want that to happen. So what I can do is I can put a $sign in between the B and the 14. And the $sign basically makes that 14 static, so it won't move as I drag it down the page. And that's what's known as an absolute reference. So I'm going to drag that down the page now. And you can see that as we've gone down the page, for example, in November, it's still dividing by B14, the total, which is what we wanted. So that's the difference between absolute and relative references. You can also put your $signs behind the column letters, like so. And that would mean that if you dragged it across the page, like this, to the right instead of down, it would still fix it in place. So if I double click in here, you can see that it's actually used this figure here in C12 because we've dragged it across one column. But because I put a $sign before the B and a $sign before the 14, it's still looking at B14 for the total, which is what we wanted. So that's a really basic introduction to formulas. What you should do is familiarize yourself with sum, average, and count, and just become very familiar with how formulas act and how Excel treats them. Make sure you know how to do these before you move on to the next stage and learn some more formulas.